Well, first of all, a very, very warm welcome to everybody calling in today. For those of you who on this unseasonably wet day, did not use the lockdown as an excuse to stay on in bed, my compliments to you and my thanks very much for joining us today. I welcome Professor Bonang Mahale, a long-time friend and in fact close enough to be called a brother, a real brother. Professor Mahale has had a remarkably illustrious career, starting early on as a medical rep, so he's well positioned to participate in the discussion today, which is really about the health crisis and the impact that that's having on the economy. Bonang was a medical rep of the Medical Control Council and actually grew to become CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, his last position, chairman of Shell South Africa, and sits on a number of boards, vice chancellor of the university in the Free State. I think if you really want to get insight into Bonang, though, one has to read his book, Lift As You Rise. The most amazing part about this book that Bonang has written is he gives experiences about what people can do to, in fact, impact life and the society in which we live. It's a remarkable insight into a man who has huge integrity and a man who has at the same time enormous compassion. So Bonang, we are most grateful to have you on a line with us today. Your belief in collaborative governance, bringing government, labor, civil society together to cooperate in a structured way was encapsulated by a comment that you made in September where you said in one of your various webinars, I think it was, we are bound by the same fate that makes us stronger together. And that really is the theme of what we're trying to, in fact, engender today. And then Ryan notes equally, I know many people listening in today will know quite a bit about Ryan, Chief Executive of Discovery Health and co-founder of an NGO called Rescue South Africa, which again gives you an insight into the fullness of this remarkable man, that he's not just a businessman. He didn't just come up the ranks of Netcare as medical director and chief operating officer, but he's actually had the passion and enthusiasm to get involved in the formation of NGOs. I'm told that, Ryan, you're a lover of helicopters. We start off today paying tribute to those whose lives were lost in service of others, who I know you were well known to and were very close to, and certainly we acknowledge their contribution and experience a moment of sadness in our hearts, quite frankly, for the tragic passing of that Netcare helicopter that went down. But not to leave it on a negative note, let's celebrate, in fact, Mazel Tov to you on the birth of your son 5 days ago, which makes it even more remarkable that you are joining us today, 5 days after the birth of your son, and have chosen, in fact, to honor the commitment made to join us and share with us today. So really to you and to Bonang, both remarkable, remarkable South Africans, who, if I may say, from a personal point of view, you guys give inspiration. You guys, it's individuals and leaders like yourself that motivate individuals like myself, and I'm sure thousands of others, to want to do more for our country, to share with the brethren that are all being universally affected by this economic and health pandemic that we're facing. And it's because of guys like you that we have hope and that we have faith. So in order today, really, Bonang, I'm going to ask you, Professor Mahale, if you would be kind enough to give us your insights, to share with us your insights as to what's going on in South Africa and what can we expect going forward, and then to ask Ryan to give a very brief presentation about the vaccines. Where are we with the vaccines and what's the likely rollout and distribution plan? So Bonang, if I may, over to you.
Mark, thank you so very much, my dear brother, for those warm words of introduction. Ryan and I are absolutely aligned that the value, the utility is really in the questions and answers and the conversations that we are going to have immediately after this. Precious, thank you so much for putting it all together. Colleagues, let me start by really order of magnitude, high level, painting a picture, probably touching on 3 buckets. So the first is when we compare ourselves with BRICS vaccine doses administered, I think it really is a telling story that as of the 27th of January 2021, Brazil had already administered 579,000 doses. Russia, 800,000. India, 2 million. China, 15 million. Of course, as a South African, I know that we are at 0. And yet, when I grew up, we used to own a company called Lennon's, the modern day Aspen. Since 2003, this ANC-led government is a shareholder, actually owns a company called BioVac, a biopharmaceutical company that is based in Cape Town. Why are we putting ourselves at the mercy of others when the world is looking at herd immunity? So our president has also set us a target of 67% herd immunity. That's 40 million South Africans, which means 800,000 must be vaccinated a day. The cost, depending on the type of vaccine that we choose, whether it's a Pfizer one, Johnson & Johnson's, AstraZeneca, or Moderna one, or the foreign exchange, because most of these today can only be imported. The dosage that we choose, whether it's a single dose or 2 doses, whether it's, again, imported or manufactured locally, that cost could be anything from 2 billion to 18 billion South African rands. When one considers that by 2018, only 16.4% of South Africans belonged to medical aids, therefore giving medical aids a maximum liability of almost 7 billion. That's about 2% of all the premiums. But I think all of us need to accept that the reason why our government missed its own commitment of the 15th of December to pay its own tranche of getting onto the COVAX program, and thanks to Solidarity Fund, and indeed to the social partners for having paid the first tranche and the second tranche, and now at least we are in that program. One needs to accept that, of course, when the vaccine found us, we were already in a spot of bother. When the pandemic found us, we were already pro-state, phased down, and absolutely finished, having just come out of a downgrade by Moody's joining the 2 others, when we had just come out of a technical recession. But actually, we were getting our loins in anticipation of surviving the 9 wasted years of state capture. So look at the figures as I conclude why we are really in a spot of bother. Our debt as we speak today is 3 trillion South African rands. We are borrowing at a rate of 2.1 billion a day. Our debt to GDP ratio is 93%. But this excludes government guarantees to the more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. If you include those, the ratio goes to 110%. It's not the percentage in and of itself. The US of A is on 200%, but they can afford to pay that debt. South Africa, at the moment, it can't. Our debt servicing cost is 20 billion. So 70% of the almost 1.4 trillion that is collected by SARS actually today goes only to 3 major buckets. One is a public sector wage bill, number 2 is social security, and of course debt. Our deficit 10 years ago was only 4%, now it's 16%. Our GDP growth for 2020 was forecast at -8%. it looks like we're trending slightly more positive. It will still be -7 at the high end. And yet our GDP growth for 2021 is anything between 1 to 2% of GDP. So which means only in 2024, we are hoping to reach our 2019 GDP numbers, so pre-COVID numbers. So the last three figures for me, and then I conclude. One is our tax revenue was going to be 18% short. That's 313 billion short. We're collecting much more than we thought. So it looks like we'll probably do anything between 240 to 280 billion. It's still a shortfall. Our exports since April, of course, have reduced. I think the figure that must really frighten all of us is that pre-COVID, our unemployment rate was approaching 40%. When you include the people that have given up and the 3 million jobs that we have lost as a direct result of COVID, we have created another 750,000. So net, we've still lost 2.2 million people. So it looks like we are going to kill more people by socio-economic devastation than the virus will. Youth unemployment is north of 60 percentage points. So a country that values more the loss of the economy than the loss of lives actually doesn't need a vaccine. It is already sick. Mark, thank you, my brother.
Well, thank you. That's very, very sobering. You know, in some peculiar way, South Africans find a way, you know, yet I must say that without necessarily combining resources, government, private sector, civil society, and international aid from foreign governments, I think it's very difficult to see a way through the next very difficult period of time that we're going to face. But human beings have created problems, and human beings therefore have the ability, I think, to resolve them. Ryan, if I may to ask you, if you would be kind enough to share with us some of your thoughts regarding the vaccine and the impact that the vaccination program might well have.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks, Bonang. It's a great privilege to be here with you today. Felt quite embarrassing through that introduction, but nonetheless, really cool to be with you and just to be with a group of people whose commitment to humanity is unquestionable. It's been inspiring from the outside to watch Africa Tikkun evolve through this COVID period. You know, the period has been defining in that some organizations have strengthened their role and demonstrated their ability to face adversity and do so much more, while others have withered away into the background. Yours is certainly the former. And so congratulations to you and all your partners and colleagues, what you've done. It's quite inspiring. And Mark, as you requested, I've kind of constrained my presentation to just a few slides. So I'm going to just select a couple of slides on vaccines. And I'm going to give you a view of what's happening globally in the vaccine creation world and the vaccine consumption world, and then also just talk about South Africa's vaccine rollout. The minister did do a webinar last night and did update quite a lot of the information, and so we can talk about some of that. And then at the end, I'll share some personal views around that, and then hand back to you and we can open it up for a discussion. So at this stage, I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know when you can see it clearly so that I know everybody can see that.
Great, thank you. It's clear for me.
Okay, you got that clearly.
Thank you.
So just talking a little bit about what's happening globally in vaccines, it may be very interesting to you and your colleagues to know that there are actually close to 200 vaccines that are now being looked at for COVID-19. I think what's absolutely astounding about this is that typically the vaccine genesis program takes 5 to 10 years. It goes through lengthy fundraising cycles, research and development cycles, trials, and then approvals prior to production. I think the biotech world has really done us an enormous favor as humanity in moving so fast and being able to apply prior learnings to a lot of this vaccine development. It's amazing that, you know, all these years into the HIV epidemic, we still don't have an HIV vaccine. We're kind of fortunate in a way, and I think we should consider ourselves fortunate that, you know, just over a year into the COVID-19 epidemic, we have some vaccines emerging. So of these, you know, 150 plus that you see on this graphic, many of them are in different stages of development. And what's important, and what I'd like to draw your eye to, is this phase 3 part here. Phase 3 are what we call double-blinded randomized trials, where human subjects at large scale to achieve statistical relevance must receive either a placebo or a vaccine without the subject or the doctor knowing which they're receiving, the placebo or the vaccine. And then they must demonstrate 2 outcomes from that phase 3 trial. 1, that the vaccine is safe, and 2, that the vaccine is effective. So the safety and efficacy data that emerges from these phase 3 trials ultimately leads to an approval. And as you can see today, there are 10 vaccines that have been approved around the world for COVID-19. Now, what I've tried to do here is label in blue dots, those blue dots that you see over there, the vaccines that of those 10 that have been approved by what we would call stringent regulators. Regulators like our regulator here in South Africa, the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, who apply very stringent conditions. They require phase 3 trial data in order to confirm the safety and efficacy of the drug. They do all sorts of statistical and clinical testing, and they make 100% sure before they approve that drug that the conditions on which it's approved, the disclosures, the information associated with it is all correct and appropriate for the population. So the 3 that you'll know a lot about now are the AstraZeneca one, which is the Oxford University vaccine that's being distributed by AstraZeneca and being sold through the Serum Institute of India. There's about 1.5 million doses of that, 1.5 billion doses of that being produced by the Serum Institute of India. And the vaccines that are landing on our shores on Monday, the first batch of 1.5 million doses, is this vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine was the first to be approved. Its profile is very impressive. It's reporting 95% efficacy. Its safety profile looks good too. The only serious side effect that's being reported is an allergic reaction in a very small number of people who are receiving it. It's what we would call an early adverse side effect. It happens as soon as you get the drug. It's treatable, and nobody has suffered severe consequence from those allergic reactions. The next one I wanted to talk about is Moderna. On top here, Moderna is a small company, effectively a startup in Boston in the USA, who've developed a vaccine on the same technology as the Pfizer vaccine. And they don't have the ability or the capacity to produce the quantity that an AstraZeneca or a Pfizer would, simply because they're a small startup company. And so Moderna have stipulated quite openly that, you know, low and middle income countries are not their target market, considering that they can only produce a constrained amount of supply. They will be targeting well-developed economies to supply their vaccine into. And then very importantly, from a South African perspective, for 2 reasons, is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. While my blue dot indicates it's already been approved, that's misleading. We expect approval for it within the next 2 weeks or so. Johnson & Johnson has not released their final phase 3 data, but we have heard from company executives that it's very favorable. And we have already seen their application for GMO approval in this country. We're waiting for the final dossiers to be submitted to SAPRA for medicines approval, as I say, within the next 2 weeks. So why do I say Johnson & Johnson is so important for South Africa? There's 2 reasons. The first is that it's a single dose vaccine, whereas the other 3 that I've just spoken about now are all double dose vaccines. Now, in medicine, that single dose has got huge advantage. The main one is that compliance associated with ensuring that we achieve the second dose administration within the 28 to 30-day window that we need to for the other vaccines is very difficult even in well-developed markets, but particularly in middle-income countries like our own, where we have some developing systems and some more rural environments. Getting compliance around that second dose is very difficult. And so the fact that Johnson & Johnson is a single-dose vaccine is very important for a country like ours. The second issue, of course, is that our very own Aspen here in South Africa, who has a biologics facility, which is a good medical practice, clean facility in Port Elizabeth, has received the contract from J&J to manufacture 30% of their global consignment. So J&J are planning to manufacture 1 billion doses of their vaccine, and they've given 300 million of those doses to Aspen to produce here in Port Elizabeth. What's concerning about that is that they retain the sole right to determine where those vaccines go once they come off the production line. So the fact that they're being produced here in South Africa doesn't mean that they come straight into South Africa. J&J could put them on a ship at the port in PE and take them elsewhere. Although there's a very good chance, because they're being produced locally, that we will gain earlier access to them. So I hope that explains to you the landscape of the ones in blue, or the stringently approved vaccines. Let me say one last thing about this, and I think this may trigger quite a few questions. The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine use a brand new technology called mRNA, messenger RNA technology. In simple terms, what the messenger RNA does is it tells your cells in your body to produce a protein. That protein is the spike protein that you see on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And once your body starts producing that protein, all of a sudden your immune system says, hang on, this is a foreign protein in my body. I better produce antibodies to it, and it elicits a very strong antibody response. The thing about this mRNA technology is that it's never been used before. This is the first time it's been used. And so there is no long-term understanding of how this mRNA technology affects the body. All the safety data is showing that it's completely safe, but we only have 6 months of that. We don't know what its impact would be in 10 years from now. If you put the syringe down on my desk today in front of me, I'd take the vaccine without thought or hesitation. I'm convinced that it's safe. But in full disclosure to you on these vaccines, it's important you know that this mRNA technology is quite new technology. On the other hand, the AstraZeneca and the J&J vaccine are built on what's called an adenovirus vector vaccine. And adenovirus vectors, where it uses another common virus, an adenovirus, to carry the spike protein into your body. And then once that protein's in your body, it elicits an immune response. That adenovirus vector vaccine is a tried and tested method used for many other kinds of vaccines over many tens of years, and the safety of it is unequivocally good. So what I'm saying to you is, if you put all 4 syringes on my desk, even though the Pfizer vaccine is reporting the highest efficacy of 95%, my own leaning would probably be to take the adenovector virus vaccines, the AstraZeneca or the J&J one. Although, just to go back to my starting point, I would take any of the 4 if you only gave me one. Important quickly to answer a question, Mark, that you asked me beforehand, and you specifically asked me to focus on, which is, what about the Sinopharm vaccine that you see here, or the Russian Sputnik V vaccine? We have strong political ties with both Russia and China. We could probably get easy access to those vaccines. And by the way, if you prepare to fly to Abu Dhabi next week, if you're prepared to stay 10 days in Abu Dhabi, you are entitled to buy the Sinovac vaccine off the shelf from a pharmacy and have it administered to you in Abu Dhabi next week. It's available in a retail market in Abu Dhabi. I would not take those vaccines if they were on the desk in front of me, and I'll tell you why not. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese have produced any phase 3 clinical trial data. They claim to have done it, but they haven't published the data. It's not available for inspection. It's not been submitted to our medicine regulator for approval. And consequently, we just have no idea about the safety and the efficacy of this, other than being reassured by its manufacturers that it's safe and effective. We've never seen any data. Now, as a clinician, that lacks evidence, and practicing evidence-based medicine, we really would much rather see the evidence before we advocated taking any particular vaccine or administering it to any of our patients or colleagues. So I hope that's particularly clear. So moving on, there have been massive demands for the vaccine, and we've seen this phenomenon emerging of vaccine nationalism, where some countries have ordered way more than what their populations require. This chart by Duke Health Innovation Center shows you what the global orders for vaccine are. What's conspicuously absent from this chart is China, because China hasn't publicly disclosed what its orders or consumption of vaccines are. So this is the world excluding China. But let me just choose one high-income country for you and give you a sense of what's going on. Look at Canada. You see Canada over here has ordered 5% of the global vaccine orders that have been placed to date, 358 million doses. Canada's population is about 38 or 40 million. So they have 10 times the number of doses than the people in their population. Assuming that it's a double dose regimen, just give them the benefit of the doubt and assume it's all for double dose regimen, it means they've got 5 times more vaccine than they need for their entire population. This is stirring up a lot of political ill feeling, a lot of bad sentiment. Why should a high income country be able to capture the global supply of vaccines way beyond their population needs? I think the one important lens to put onto it, which is very relevant, is that supply is constrained until probably mid-year, maybe even later than mid-year. I'm hearing up to September this year from very reliable sources. During that supply constrained period, I don't think there'll be excess vaccine in any of these countries. I'm almost certain there won't. Further to that, I think the moment that there is excess vaccine in a country like Canada, I'm very hopeful that they will release that excess to middle income countries and lower income countries like us. We've, of course, approached the Canadians and asked them to give us some of their supply. And at this stage, they've said, we've got 600,000 vaccines in the country. We haven't got enough to give you any supply at the moment. So, on a personal level, I think it does stir up some emotion and ill sentiment, but it is the way of the world. And I suppose it's a fact of how higher income countries work. So vaccination has commenced now in about, from what I last heard, 32 countries. 32 countries have started their vaccination program. Our vaccines arrive next week, and it will start very soon after that. And you can see how vaccination is progressing as a percentage of the total population. What's off the charts and not visible here is Israel's performance. Israel has vaccinated now about 1/3 of their population. And you can see the index on this chart goes up to 10%. So Israel is well off this chart, having vaccinated 1/3. But we are learning important lessons. And we did yesterday a webinar with the vaccination teams from 5 countries, France, Belgium, the United Kingdom. There were 2 other countries on the call who gave us advice and shared with us their learnings about their early vaccination rollout programs, so that we can hopefully not pay those school fees and learn the lessons from them. United Kingdom is now vaccinating about 400,000 people a day. The US is now doing 1.6 million a day. But the UK is relevant because its population is there and thereabouts, roughly the same size as ours. So if we could do half of what the UK is doing, 200,000 people a day, we'd be doing 2 million people every 10 days, which would be, I think very, very good, very, very good progress. So let me quickly talk to you about how the SA vaccine funding and rollout is working. Let me caveat this by saying the following. It's changing on a daily basis. We really don't know where it's going to land up. But it does look like it will be a multi-funded model on the left-hand side here, where government, the Solidarity Fund, medical schemes, and the private sector, business in South Africa, and Bonang's in a great position to talk to us about that, will jointly contribute funding into a collective vaccine-funded pool. Just to speak to the medical scheme piece, which is very relevant to me and of course to many of you, what we have agreed through a pricing mechanism is that the price we'll pay for vaccines in the private sector will be roughly double the cost price of the vaccine. And what that will do is it will cross-subsidize for every medical scheme member who receives a dose, one dose for a public sector person, somebody who's uninsured. Now, that's the way medicines are priced in South Africa anyway. The private sector pays roughly double the state tender price on most medicines. So it's no different to how medicines are priced. And the health economics of it are very favorable for medical schemes. It pays medical schemes a return on investment to pay for the vaccines and gain access to them quickly and then get a return on investment from having vaccinated members. So that pooled money pays for the vaccine from the manufacturers. Stock is then allocated, and through a very efficient and very equitable and fair system with close cooperation, there's distribution agreed through the private sector and the public sector. I should tell you that in South Africa, we have a very strong vaccination program in both private and public. The public sector vaccination program is excellent, and they've got a very strong team at the Department of Health who lead the national vaccination program. And they are planning a combination of workplace vaccine programs, mobile vaccine programs, and hospital-based vaccination programs. There are going to be mass vaccination centers set up by the Department of Health, and this planning is quite well advanced. There's a prioritization agreed for how the vaccination is rolled out. This has been guided by the Ministerial Advisory Committee on Vaccines, which is led by Professor Barry Shube. And Professor Shube and his team have agreed something that looks like this. This is at a very high level. There's much more detail below this. Phase 1, which starts next week, is for frontline healthcare workers. There's about 1.25 million of them. And their batch of vaccine arrives next week. They'll be the first to receive it in mostly a worksite rollout program in healthcare centers. Phase 2, which is about 15 million people, goes first to essential workers, then to people who are in congregate settings like old-aged homes, frail care homes, where they're living very close together and they have very high risk and are highly susceptible to bad manifestations of COVID-19. Then to the elderly, first in two groups, first people over 75 and then people over 60, and then to adults older than 18 years who are living with some severe comorbidity that puts them at high risk for COVID-19. So that's phase 2 of about 15 million people. And our aspiration as a country is to try and immunize or vaccinate phase 1 and phase 2 by the middle of the year. I'm not sure we're going to make it. It's a stark aspiration, but if we can do that, that would be outstanding. And then the next big group, probably a lot of people on this call, is 22 million people who are older than 18 years of age, but don't fit into these prior groups. They're not essential workers. They don't have any comorbidities, but they are adult South Africans. It's important to point out to you that the vaccines have not been trialed in children. And so the AstraZeneca and Moderna vaccine are approved only in people of 16 years of age and older. The Pfizer vaccine only in 18 years of age and older. And so they haven't been trialed in children, and children will not yet be receiving the vaccination. So lastly, my very last slide before I kind of wrap up with some personal comments and hand back to you, just to say that the focus of a lot of our work at the moment through the task teams that we're working in and advisory groups supporting the Department of Health is to try and get more vaccine before June. If you look at the rollout of this vaccine from January to June, you can see that there's only about 8 to 10 million doses, which is about 4 to 5 million people coming in before June. That's not enough. We think we need at least another 10 million doses before June. So we're doing a lot of work to try and finalize the funding arrangements, which is being led by a task team reporting directly to the minister, and to procure more vaccine and land it in South Africa before June. Ultimately, we will have enough vaccine to get to the 71% of the population by the end of the year. And so those orders are secure, but we'd like to vaccinate the higher risk people sooner. Let me say that this is I'm going to stop my share. Let me say that this is a complex operation, the likes of which I think no public health program has ever seen. The vaccine is safe. The vaccine is important. It has individual and public health benefits. And of course, as Bonang was saying earlier, will have an immediate impact on the macroeconomy to help get our GDP growing again and to get business working again. So not only does it save lives, but it has this massive economic impact, hence the rush and the urgency to get it done. Let me pause there, Mark, and hand back to you.
Ryan, fascinating, and again, very, very interesting to see the private sector cooperating with government to task themselves with what is really a huge, huge objective. And as you say, if by June we can have those numbers vaccinated, the impact not only on the health of our population, but on our economy and our ability to effectively return to work must have a positive impact on GDP. I'm going to actually open the floor to questions in just a few minutes, but if I may, slightly different angle to just give a sense of, whilst this pandemic is going on, there is still the enormous need to educate, skill, train our youth for job opportunities. And it's in the spirit of what you've shared with us, this cooperation, the belief that Bonang has preaches so often about the need for government, labor, and civil society and business to cooperate together, that I'd like to, if I may, just take the liberty of sharing just a few quick slides about Africa Tikkun, which has been known really to be a charitable organization from inception, having started some sort of 25 years ago, with a view to helping South Africans who are in the most critically impoverished environments to develop their children and their youth such that they can become productive members of society, committed to jobs and careers that they're well suited to and have got the appropriate hard and soft skills for. So very briefly, if I may, the model that Africa Tikkun has developed over the last 15 years in particular has really been what we call our cradle to career model, where we say that early intervention in a child's development is key critical if you're going to imbue appropriate values. People who are receptive to learning are obviously going to be better students and more adept at putting what they've learned through their development cycle into practice when they do get into the working place. So what Tikkun has done is it's gone into communities and worked with those local communities. Key critical is a belief that local communities have the competency and the desire to develop their children and their youth. And we build early childhood centers. We build youth support centers for after schools programs. We then offer a gap year, which mediates between finishing school and going either into university or into the working environment, where individuals can, again, learn more about who they are and about the working environments that they face. And throughout the process, there are various interventions that Tikkun institutes. So for argument's sake, in early childhood development, it's not just numeracy literacy. We teach basic principles about respect for teachers, respect for parents, which hopefully will translate into respect for society in general. In our youth development programs, we're very cognizant of the importance of not only providing meals, but teaching individuals about nutrition and well-being and the choices that they are empowered to make that help them to effectively help themselves. So in dealing with the virus, for argument's sake, in this recent time, we've spent an enormous amount of time and funding making materials available to children and youth who believe in the work that Tikkun is doing, to say to them why it's so important to wear masks. While it might seem infra-dig to go, out into the streets wearing a mask, the importance of why it is so critical even to wear a mask within, the shack environment. And that then translates into a variety of other areas of intervention where we get engaged in helping individuals with career choices, vocational testing, to enable them to choose which direction they want to go, and subject choices at school. And again, the programs are so complex and interwoven that no one organization can do it on its own. So Tikkun has developed an array of partnering relationships with other community-based organizations in the first instance. We've also developed relationships with government. And as can be seen from this next slide, you can get a sense of the array of interventions that we feel are critically important if in fact an individual is to go through this development process and then be able to participate in programs like the YES Initiative, which is a work experience program. It's pointless taking people who have not got the attributes or the desire into a YES program, paying them R3,500 Rand a month, because you're not going to get the desired outcome of individuals who are going to use the experience to necessarily advance themselves. The next slide shows effectively how this whole program necessarily hangs together. And as you can see, it starts very early on in a child's life and it moves through very successive, hopefully seamless phases. Now, this model that you're seeing in front of you is in fact a model that together with the Minister of Social Development, we are anticipating rolling out into communities across the country as part of Tikkun's expansion program. So rather than going and building more centers and taking on the liability of having to run these centers ourselves, the whole philosophy is bottom up, get the community to understand where they necessarily need to invest time, energy, efforts, and funds, get them to work with the local corporate market in that area, and then use government to help facilitate and empower the whole process on a geographic by geographic basis. This X factor that we talk about is what we're trying to sell, market into communities to show the multiplier effect. So instead of training for the sake of training alone, training and education orients towards where opportunities necessarily lie. To achieve this, what we're attempting to do, and we have in fact at the moment 3 pilot sites beyond our own centers, which are completely new sites for us, where we've gone and identified people, organizations within the communities, identified companies and businesses within those communities, and pulling them into the early planning phase together with the Department of Social Development, Department of Education, Department of Health, starting to work out game plans, which might be 3 to 5 year time horizons. But as you can see, each party starts to recognize the contributions that they necessarily can make. And so what we're really trying to do is we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. What we're doing is trying to actually get initiatives that are already underway, well-meaning initiatives, and integrate them in some coordinated fashion. The amazing thing about South Africa, that certainly I've experienced from working here and working internationally, is that there are thousands upon thousands of goodwill initiatives, over 250,000 registered non-for-profit organizations. Corporate South Africa is spending close on 9 billion a year on CSI initiatives, and that's before the spend that of approximately 16 billion that they're spending on enterprise development. So that's just from private sector, NGO, civil society efforts. We all know about the billions that are being spent by the Department of Social Development on social grants. And we now have a minister who has a vision to no longer just give out grants and create further dependency, but to rather invest social monies into the upliftment of individuals who are capable of taking on jobs and being productive, and equally starting their own business initiatives themselves. The map of South Africa gives a sense of just how many organizations with huge substance are working in various different, what I almost want to call silos, that we're now trying to, as I say, integrate into this seamless cradle to career model. In closing, I genuinely do believe that the crisis that Bonang referred to, some of the solutions that Ryan has referred to, showcasing how this crisis is forcing us to necessarily work together, should not be limited to just dealing with the virus and the pandemic. It should be applied to the economic crisis, the economic pandemic that we're facing. It is only through collaboration that we've got a hope in hell of getting ourselves through the mess that we find ourselves in. And again, as I made mention at the end of Bonang's speech, it's human beings who've created the situation that we find ourselves in. We can point fingers at Zuma administration, but there, we were all somewhat complicit because we, as a nation, voted him in as our, we voted in the ANC and voted in the ANC, then voted him in as president. We all could have done more earlier on to stop effectively the theft that was going on in this country. And equally, I do believe that if we, instead of pointing fingers of blame all around, rather in fact say, we are where we are today, let's look forward to the future together. And what can we do if we push bureaucracies aside and push egos aside and realize the extent of the crisis? Bonang, you made that very real for us all. We don't have time any longer to allow our egos to stand in the way. We have to work collaboratively together. We've got to stop and listen, genuinely listen to what some of the solutions necessarily might be. So again, grateful thanks, Bonang, Ryan, for your input. I think I'm going to open the discussion today to members that have joined us, to people that have joined us, and say grateful thanks to each and every one of you for journeying with us, and take any questions through the chat. May I ask anybody who's got questions, put them up to, on the chat, please? Can you see it? Questions that have come through are just, can we put copies of the presentation or a recording of this presentation, which we'll certainly do. Precious, perhaps you'd be good enough to put that up on our website, www.africatikkun.org. Rosalind, good morning to you. Rosalind, you're on. Are there any questions that you had? I think that's probably an error.
Mark, I see a question on the chat group here. What is the opinion in terms of compulsory vaccination?
Yes.
It looks like it was sent to me directly, so maybe I should cover that. The Constitution doesn't allow any healthcare system to force any citizen in South Africa to take medicines that they don't want to. So by law, constitutionally, we cannot line people up and force them to receive a jab. It leads me on to a very important issue around what's called anti-vaxxer sentiment. There is this very strong lobby around anti-vaxxers, people who are saying that you should stay away from vaccines. It doesn't only relate to COVID-19 vaccination, it relates to many other types of vaccination, with many conspiracy theories involved in that. There was a very interesting survey that emerged yesterday afternoon that Bonang, Mark, and I were chatting around beforehand, where they surveyed all South Africans, a representative sample of South Africans, and asked, would you take the vaccine? And roughly 2/3, 66% of South Africans, it was 67, said they would take the vaccine were they to be offered it. That sounds like a lot, but actually 1 in 3 people saying that they would refuse the vaccine is a very high number. A very high number. I think, you know, for me, we need powerful public education campaigns to make sure that we can deal with some of the real baseless fake news, as Mark called it, that's circulating not only in, you know, educated groups, but also, unfortunately, you know, in all groups. We've even seen politicians in South Africa who've linked, you know, 5G towers, for example, to being a cause of COVID-19. This is just simply fake news, and so is the anti-vaxxer sentiment. And we need to, you know, have a steady, leadership-driven campaign to demonstrate that leaders will stand up first, will take the vaccine, and make sure that we can get rid of this misinformation associated with it. It's deeply worrying to us. In our models of take-up through the country, we've prepared various economic and take-up models. We've assumed a 70% take-up rate on the timing of reaching that 67% herd immunity threshold by the end of 2021. And so that is the assumption in our models, but hopefully we can, through good education, do much better than that.
Ryan, thanks very much for that. Is there a view that you've got as to what corporates should be doing to deal with the myths that surround the vaccines? I mean, are you aware of any information that necessarily can be downloaded by corporations such as ours, for argument's sake, who have the reach into township communities and have got the ability and budget to be able to put materials out into those communities that we could download and share with people?
Mark, it's all being prepared at the moment. I haven't seen it pre-packaged yet. Be assured, from a discovery perspective, we'll prepare that material meticulously, and we will make it available as part of the employer toolkits that we've provided throughout COVID. You can go onto our COVID-19 information hub, which is on our discovery website on the landing page. You need not be a member to access it. That information hub has become a very reliable source of COVID-19 information for the public. And there is a large section on vaccines there that will help you at this stage.
Ryan, I see there's also a question from Arnold Foreman asking about how medical aids are actually going to distribute to their members, as they don't necessarily have all the employment information.
Yeah, pretty interesting question. The final distribution plan is not resolved. There is a lot of conversation going on between government, supported by B4SA, the Business for South Africa Advisory Committee that's been formed for COVID-19 vaccines in which we participate, and the schemes. And it's still an emerging plan. My own preference is that the existing medicine supply chain be used. We have a strong medicine supply chain in the private sector. We have excellent logistics companies like Imperial and the likes of them who handle the logistics and the cold chain, massive wholesalers like UPD, and very effective retailers like Clicks through that whole supply chain who, you know, handle medicines daily and who do it with efficiency, with very little wastage, and with good inventory control. So my own hope, and this is certainly what we're debating in the working groups, is that in the private sector, we can use the existing medicine supply chains, and that through the electronic vaccine data system that we're supporting the National Department of Health to stand up, we will be able to identify the individuals who are in the higher risk categories. Certainly at discovery, we know who they are, notify them of their eligibility for a vaccine, allow them to register on that electronic vaccine data system, or the EVDS as it's being called, and make sure that they present themselves at a pharmacy for a vaccine. We want to keep it as simple as that. We think that simplicity is elegant and that using the existing supply chain really works. There are groups who feel that we need parallel systems, mass vaccination centers, bespoke different approaches, and that's all being debated at the moment.
Bonang, I see a question that's come through to me on my phone, which is to ask your views as to the efficacy of the parties that are going to be responsible for the importation and the distribution of the vaccines, bearing in mind the experience of PPC distribution. There was a question raised as to, do you believe that there are sufficient controls, and can there be sufficient controls to ensure that we don't see, again, massive theft?
Mark, let me start first by supporting Ryan to say our only salvation in this pandemic is to say, let's continue to comply with the health protocols, the non-pharmaceutical health protocols, because by the time they come to you and I, Mark, it will probably be June. So this notion of continuing to work at home, of social distancing, self-quarantining when you have been exposed, of wearing a mask and washing your hands with running water and soap, that's really our salvation. I mean, a vaccine is not going to be a silver bullet. For the next 6 months, I think we'll still be absolutely petrified of this virus. Number two, the only way we will be able to emerge victorious is when all the social partners work together. You see, the private sector knows how to deliver this thing called project management. Mega projects, on time, on budget, and in full. Let me be persuasive and say, AB InBev, Anheuser-Busch, old SAB, has twice as many shebeens as there are schools in this country. And they deliver successfully to every single solitary one of these shebeens every week. Government on its own cannot even deliver books to Limpopo once a year. So imagine if you put those two together, I think this vaccine can then have a major reach. We already have massive courier companies, logistics companies that have cold trucks that can maintain the cold chain. Lastly, specifically to the question, the reason why our advice to business was at the time of the PPE procurement, when they announced a 500 billion rand socio-economic stimulus, we said it's going to be stolen. So you have to put systems and processes in place before to make sure that it doesn't get stolen. And guess what? It was stolen in a coordinated, integrated fashion. The Gauteng government alone says 2/3 of their PE budget was stolen. 2/3 was stolen. So now we are saying for the vaccines, we have the Auditor General, but you audit post the event. How can we proactively make sure that this doesn't get stolen? So we're working with National Treasury, and we are working with business and all social partners to say, number one, let there be central procurement of these vaccines. There's an element, of course, there of fairness, of being equitable, but also of social justice. Because it doesn't matter when you have money and you can fly to Dubai and get yourself vaccinated. You come back to your neighbor who's not, and you still get infected. It's about herd immunity. So here, self-centered and egocentrism doesn't actually help you. It will kill you. This is the only time where if you have got 4 vaccines, like Canada has 10 times their population, you want to take one and give 9 to your other neighbors because that's how you survive. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. And I think that sentiment, rings very, very true across us all. I'm going to just take two last questions, if I may. Interestingly enough, I see my cousin Maxine from America, New York, and I don't know what she's doing up at this time, has sent a note to say that anti-vaccine sentiment in the US has declined since the vaccines have actually been introduced quite significantly. There was a question that was asked about, do you foresee, Ryan, vaccination against COVID will become compulsory when wanting to travel? Will we actually have to have a, yellow fever, cholera certificate?
Very likely. Qantas Airline was the first airline to move on this. And already in November, the Qantas CEO stipulated that nobody will be allowed onto a Qantas flight without a vaccination certificate. We've seen a coalition of IT companies coming together globally, led by Microsoft, but including also the CRM guys, Salesforce, supported by the Mayo Clinic and joined now by Oracle. And they're forming a global vaccine passport. It will be a token that you carry on your phone. It will be unique to you, uniquely identified to you with the biometric link, and it will be able to prove your vaccination status. In South Africa, our Department of Health is calling it the Electronic Vaccination Certificate, the EVC. The Minister has launched it last night, in fact. Behind the scenes, our Chief Information Officer at Discovery, Maya Samava, is leading the IT work stream for Business for SA that is cooperating with government on the creation of this electronic vaccine data system. And so, the development is underway. You can imagine in a moment like this that every developer and every IT company popped out of the woodwork to say they've got a vaccine inventory management system. And so there's a process being led by and coordinated by the Department of Health of looking at all of those, determining the right one for South Africa, building it and deploying it. We built the COVID Alert SA app for the Department of Health. That's the contact tracing app. I hope you're all familiar with it, and I hope you've all got it on your devices. If you don't, please download it right now from your app store. It uses Bluetooth technology hosted by Apple and Google in a cooperative agreement between them to do contact tracing. And it's worked brilliantly. We built it. We gave the source code to the Department of Health. They own it and they run it. And we're hoping that the vaccine passport, whoever builds it also just gives the source code to the Department of Health. It becomes the country's asset, and that it's completely interoperable with these global systems that are being developed. So we're very hopeful about that.
Ryan, the question from Mike Esmond was, are the new strains of COVID potentially going to defy the vaccines that are being made at the moment? Is there a belief that
this is the billion-dollar question, Mike. I wish I knew the answer. Let me tell you where we are as of last night. The Pfizer vaccine remains effective against all three of the current new variants, the B117 variants, version 1, version 2, and version 3. The Pfizer vaccine apparently remains effective. That's only been tested in vitro. So what they do is they take the variant vaccine, they see what the antibody reaction to it is, and that determines effectiveness. And Pfizer says it's effective. Moderna, 2 days ago, came out and said their vaccine is effective against version 1 and 2, but version 3, which is the one that we've got here in South Africa, elicits a lower antibody response. So the antibody response from the Moderna vaccine is less effective against version 3. What Moderna has said they're going to do is they're going to produce a booster. So much like, if you know the childhood vaccination schedule, you get a mumps, measles, and rubella booster. So you get the original vaccine and then you have a booster sometime later. Moderna says they're going to produce a booster for their vaccine that will improve your immunity to this version 3 variant. I I should tell you that there's a lot of excitement that the antibody response, the baseline, is actually very high. So even though it's less effective against this version 3 variant, it still remains quite effective. The big question, Mike, that everybody's asking about this is, with new mutations and new variant formation over time, is there going to be a need for a seasonal vaccine, a seasonal booster every year to boost your immunity against the new variants of the time? We very much hope that's not the case. If that is the case, we're in for a much longer haul. But we very much hope that's not the case. So only time will tell. And unfortunately, nobody knows that answer now.
Guys, in the last sort of few minutes that we've got, can I ask very quickly, Ryan, for you to give a sense of, and equally I'm asked the same of Bonang, what should we as corporates be doing through this time period? What are roles that we could play? You know, and I'm not here just blowing smoke. Discovery really has been quite a remarkable organization through this whole period of time. You know, there's so many criticisms of Discovery.
I never hear those. I've never heard any criticism of Discovery.
You know, about, you know, but Discovery being such a, you know, the tall poppy syndrome, being such a remarkable organization that has been homegrown. What's been, I think, particularly astounding is to see the real social responsibility that Discovery stood up for. You know, designing tech and giving that tech over pro bono to government. There's genuinely a sense of compassion that Discovery has had, not only for its members, its paying members, but for South African society in general. And you, Ryan, in particular, you know, have represented that. You and Adrian and, you know, all the guys that are senior executives in the organization, you've stood up for South Africa and for South Africans during this process. Equally, I have a question to ask the same of Bonang. Bonang, what do you think corporate South Africa can and should be doing? And if I could close on just that question with responses from the two of you, I'd be most grateful.
I'm happy to have a first go, and then Bonang can wrap us up with his wisdom. I mean, the starting point, you know, Mark, is to say we have a responsibility to our employees, their families, and society to ensure that we communicate responsible messaging. And I'm being asked by a lot of business leaders at the moment, when should I bring people back to office? How long is the second phase going to last? When is it going to tail off? You know, I would urge that you create the following calming mindset among your people. 2021, unfortunately, is going to look a lot like 2020 did in terms of social distancing, mask wearing, and the caution that's required. If we are to believe the Swiss cheese model of prevention, we should all just get our heads around working virtually, being maximally productive, looking after each other in that respect, and remaining socially distanced with good hygiene precautions and masks on at all time. And I think that corporate South Africa, and particularly the leadership, has an enormous responsibility to create calm and acceptance around that. If as leaders, we're in denial and we're saying the second wave is nearly over, we're going to be back in the office by the middle of February, I want all my teams back at the beginning of March, you know, that's effectively denial. We need to get to a point of acceptance. So that would be part one, is that leaders must advocate calmness, more social distance, more non-pharmaceutical interventions. I think the second point is solidarity. And you made that point very brilliantly, Mark, is that we do need to come together, all socioeconomic groups across all diversity lines, to stand together and make this response work. That means private and public in harmony on the purchasing of vaccines, the distribution plan, the support of people who can't get food at the moment, the support of businesses that are collapsing around us. We need real solidarity. It's a time for people to stand up, and particularly corporate South Africa to stand up, be counted, and stand together in the solidarity. And, you know, the third point I'm going to make and stop there and hand over to Bonang is just to say we are looking for inspiring leadership. Mark, you at Africa Tikkun have demonstrated that through the amazing feeding program and the way the organization has become even more relevant and morphed through COVID-19. I'm surrounded by that. Adrian Gore is leading the ministerial task team for the procurement of vaccines. Ayanda and Saluba in our team is a director of the Solidarity Fund and is leading the allocation of funds out of the Solidarity Fund to health causes. Johnny Broomberg has built the the health team inside the Solidarity Fund and ensured that that money ultimately reaches source for procurement of PPE and so on. I'm surrounded by those inspiring people. I would ask corporate South Africa to find a way to personally inspire and make a difference. And if that's the mindset that you've exhibited, Mark, that these people around me have exhibited, then I genuinely believe as a nation, we will succeed. And as a corporate sector, we will come to be counted when the chips are down. Bonang?
So I think from government, our expectation is that they should provide ethical leadership, even though it sounds tautologous, because leadership cannot be anything other than ethical. We need absolute transparency to make sure that this is not looted. We need final accountability. When somebody has taken something that doesn't belong to them, there must be consequence management. From business, what we require is an acceptance that today, most boards are kept awake by the fact that corporate decision-making can not only be consistent with the whims of the shareholders, but has to consider a much broader stakeholder community, the society where they're located, the community that is indeed affected by them, the NGO sector, and indeed civil society. But I think business's number one priority is to say, can we survive this pandemic? The Spanish flu, February 1918 to April 2020, came in 4 consecutive waves. So we are still on our second wave. I think let's prepare for the worst before it gets better. So as business, you really want to survive. You survive by cash preservation and strengthening your balance sheet. But most importantly, you survive by recognizing that people are your most important asset. So you have to focus on this notion called employee well-being, because health is not just the absence of disease and infirmity. It is a state of both physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. Also, business has to bring about this notion of shared value. You know, ESG today, as part of a UN SDG, if you're not looking at shared value, you're missing the mark. I think we also need to make sure that our executives are held accountable to the commitments that they make. As business, we need to do no harm. Our people must come home and whole to our offices and to our factories and to our refineries. They must go back to their loved ones and significant relationships in the same state. Business has the capacity to make sure that they take this notion of HSSE as an acronym for health, safety, security, and environment very seriously. But also business must go out of their way to make the world a better place, because they've got a disproportionate voice, but also disproportionate resources. It is business's job to ensure that they grow their own timber. Therefore, they must take this notion of education much more seriously. The skills that we need for today, 4IR, Internet of Things, coding, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, that's not the job of government. No, it is the job of business. The challenge that we have, Mark, as I conclude, is that all of us must be looking at the same script, so that all of us, we understand the current diagnosis, so that we come to the same prognosis by putting the same plans in place. We need to be reasonably coherent. At the moment, we're pulling in different directions. This is the period where this country is suffering from the lowest levels of confidence, of trust and hope since the Second World War. And yet we know that leaders are dealers in hope. Thanks, Mark.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I certainly believe that the two of you gentlemen have left us with an enormous amount of hope. Ryan, you've dealt with a lot of the skepticism around the vaccines. Bonang, you've made it very clear to us just how critical the situation is. And, you know, I'm hoping that the Africa Tikkun Cradle to Career rollout model is a small microcosm of what potentially we could achieve across this country by collaborating together. I'm feeling confident that life has never had more purpose than it does right now. So thank you to you all, and thank you to everybody who has called in today. May God bless you and keep you all safe, and wear a mask and keep distance. God bless all. Thank you.